I thought we were alive and kicking last time, but I think we were on the wrong track. So thanks, Veta, for fixing that. So again, welcome to the Foundations course, broadcast from Columbia University for the entire MDP network. And we're hoping that lots of students of the MDP network are joining us and for the subsequent classes over the next 13 weeks. We actually have 14 weeks, but we have 13 weeks of global classroom. Again, I'd like to welcome you. I'm Professor Dr. Shiv Someshwar, teaching this course with my esteemed colleague, Professor Dr. Jeffrey D. Sachs, who will be with you shortly. I look forward to engaging with all of you through Google Hangout, as well as with the Columbia students. We have, following the global classroom, we have an hour plus session more for discussion and to get your ideas and to kind of discuss the readings and so on. So with that, I'm not going to belabor the second live broadcast. I would like to welcome Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs to the podium. Jeff?
Good morning, everybody. Hi, and hello around the world. I hope our Google Hangout is working well. And it's really a pleasure to have a new group of students here. Welcome. And we have 2 years together to turn you into leaders of sustainable development and champions and leaders of the new Sustainable Development Goals. And I trust the same will be true for students around the world. We're on the verge of what ought to be and what can be a new era of public policy. And that is one that puts the idea of sustainable development at the very center of global cooperation. I'm going to give you a little bit of background to this today. We've tried this before globally. The last big attempt to make sustainable development the thing was the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio, which was a very important event that created lots of important international agreements on climate change and biodiversity and protecting drylands and other really crucial objectives. But it didn't work because 20 years on, actually 23 years since the Rio Earth Summit, we have a mess of problems that are the reason why we're trying again globally to reset the direction of public policy and the world economy so that it is more fair, more sustainable, so that it achieves the goals of sustainable development. And you're all very lucky, wherever you are in the world watching this, and for us here at Columbia University, this is the moment. So this is going to be the next few weeks that will critically decide how we're doing, because we have coming up just in a little over 2 weeks the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you will be a couple weeks ahead of the world on this. By the time the world adopts them, you will know 17 SDGs by heart and in order, if you don't already. But that's the first homework assignment. Is to know the Sustainable Development Goals. And our whole program, in a way, can be viewed as empowering you to be leaders in this effort over the coming generation and more. The new Sustainable Development Goals will have a 15-year duration. They will apply for the period January 1, 2016, in other words, second semester, and all the way to the end of 2030. And during those 15 years, lots of good things are supposed to happen in the world economy to redirect how the world economy works, to make it more environmentally sustainable, actually to end extreme poverty by 2030. These are big, bold, difficult, but achievable objectives. And the purpose of this course is to figure out what they mean, why they're important, and how they could possibly be achieved. Now, to achieve goals that are so complicated and so deeply rooted in the way that economies and politics and societies operate will require lots of innovation, creativity, brainstorming, guts, hard work, good luck over a 15-year period. There's no ready-made blueprint to say, if you want to do this, here's the list of things to do. What we can do at best is to give the background, the analytical ideas around issues like climate change, fighting poverty, fighting hunger, controlling or ending the devastating loss of biodiversity, but to actually succeed in the big objectives that will be adopted, that will require a tremendous amount of politics and innovation at the local level in every part of the world. So when we adopt these goals shortly, this is not for a blueprint run out of New York or out of this classroom or out of the General Assembly of the United Nations. It's really an invitation for worldwide brainstorming and worldwide problem solving. The purpose of the goals, first and foremost, is to say it is really important on the planet that we agree to do the following things: head off the climate change disaster, fight extreme poverty, address the shortfalls of health access and education access, make sure that everybody has access to modern energy services, and so on. And then to use those goals as a motivation and impetus and a kind of guide for action from local levels, from cities and rural communities around the world up through the global cooperation. Now, those new goals are going to be adopted by about the 4th week of the class, and that will give us a good framework. There will be lots of very interesting things to discuss in these first few weeks as the goals are actually adopted, because this ought to be a historic moment. We'll look back and decide whether it was just a lost opportunity or whether it was really the historic breakthrough. But right now we should treat it as potentially really historic. And so let's keep our eyes open, debate the issues, listen carefully to how these new goals are adopted and how they unfold. Now, a few weeks after that, towards the end of the semester, will be a second really pivotal event. It'll be the first test, in a way, of the Sustainable Development Goals, because the Sustainable Development Goals will be non-binding, shared objectives of the United Nations members. Now, technically, what that means is the 193 states that are the member states of the UN. Of course, the goals need to be people's goals, not just government's goals, if this is going to work. But technically, the goals will be adopted by the 193 member states of the UN. That will happen on September 25th. Then, in early December, basically the same list of governments with a couple of footnotes on representation will meet again for a legally binding agreement on climate change. And that will be in Paris starting November 30th and ending around December 10. That's called COP21. That is the Conference of the Parties, COP, 21st meeting, because the first one was in Berlin in 1995. This is the 21st meeting of the parties in Paris in December. And the purpose of this meeting is to agree on a legally binding approach to the control of anthropogenic climate change. Anthropogenic meaning anthropos, human, genic, caused, anthropogenic, human-caused climate change. We signed a treaty in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. on climate change. Anybody know the name of that treaty? The initials? It is the UNFCCC, okay? The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that agreement was reached in 1992. It's a framework that says the world's governments agree to head off dangerous, anthropogenic, human-caused interference in the climate system. So they agreed 23 years ago. But agreeing to something is quite different from doing it, right? So 23 years later, we haven't done it yet. And to implement a convention like the UNFCCC, governments generally agree on protocols to implement these broad, overarching treaties or conventions. So there was one protocol that was agreed, the Kyoto Protocol, back in 1997 at COP3, which was in Kyoto, but the United States never joined it. The developing countries were not obligated under it, so the biggest of all emitting countries today in the world, which is China, was not a party to the Kyoto Protocol, and with the US not joining it, the two biggest greenhouse gas emitting countries in the whole world weren't part of the action, and so the Kyoto Protocol failed. And it finished a few years ago, 2012 was its legal run. And so we don't have right now a way to implement this 1992 agreement. On September 25th, when the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are adopted, SDG 13 will be control human-induced climate change, not as a treaty, but as one of the 17 agreed Sustainable Development Goals. Then comes the test. Does this kind of agreement mean anything? Well, the governments will meet in early December, and the question is whether for the first time since the Framework Convention was signed in 1992, they will actually agree to implement it. We'll talk a lot about that during the course. There are hopeful signs. This could be pretty good semester because we're going to get SDGs, and there's a pretty good chance we're going to get a climate agreement. And that's most importantly because the major economies in the world are now seeing eye to eye politically on this more than they ever have before. The United States, the European Union, China, the three biggest emitting regions are more or less in agreement. We need an agreement. And India and many other countries which have been skeptical are saying, yes, we see the point. We just want to make sure the agreement is fair and allows us to continue to have economic development in the context of controlling human-induced climate change. So this is a pretty interesting time to have this class. And it's really worth paying attention. And I mean over the 2 years, because if we're good at this in conveying the importance and the details of this subject, and you're good at this in working really hard to absorb this, you're going to be entering a global political, economic, financial, and technological environment which says, yeah, we're trying to achieve sustainable development. Tell us what you know. Tell us how to do it. So there ought to be, coming out of the next few months, a kind of groundswell for expertise, knowledge, capacity to actually pursue this agenda. So that's the main reason we're here. Now, I've asked you as the lead up to this to read a lot of seemingly obscure ancient texts. Ancient these days means anything written more than 12 months ago, right? But I wanted you to go back and read, starting about 225 years ago, a little excerpt by Adam Smith, and then to read from 1798, an essay by Thomas Robert Malthus, who wrote the most famous essay in history about human population, where he said that the human population would always grow to the point where living standards on Earth was pushed back down to low levels, so that we'd always be facing a kind of population crisis. And Malthus was the famous pessimist, because he said, if there's a new invention which allows you to grow more food or to live at a higher living standard, that will then promote a rise of population, and that will drive down the living standards again, because there will be more people and smaller land per person, and we'll be back in a way where we started. And that is part of our debate right now, because we are 7.3 billion people on the planet. When Malthus wrote his essay, there were 900 million people. So there's been an 8-time rise of population since then. And the United Nations Population Division just made a forecast, which it revises every couple of years. It made the 2015 revision, and it forecasts about 11 billion people by the end of this century, with the huge increase of population in sub-Saharan Africa. 4-fold rise of population in Africa, from 1 billion to 4 billion people. That's not exactly a forecast, it's a kind of scenario if we continue on the business as usual course that the world is on right now. So I wanted you to read Malthus because he raised this question. And then there are excerpts from other really important thinkers that aim to kind of give you a little bit of perspective on how we got to our challenges and situation today. So in 1848, Marx and Engels wrote a bestseller called The Communist Manifesto. It has continued to circulate since then, still in print. It basically says the world's unfair because the powerful exploit the weak. In human dynamics, that provokes revolutionary change. I'm paraphrasing. But I want to give some context to this, because Marx and Engels wrote in the middle of the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, when industry was booming, when the British Empire was becoming the world empire. And they were viewing this critically as saying, well, that's fine and good, but you're creating a class of power and inequality that's unprecedented, that will have a revolutionary reaction. I ask you to read a very important set of chapters from John Maynard Keynes. Now, John Maynard Keynes was the greatest political economist of the 20th century, the greatest thinker and actor linking economics and politics. He was British, and he was the greatest thinker about economy during the heyday of the British Empire, and then during the Great Depression. And Keynes gave us the modern theories of explaining the Great Depression. And then he was a great architect of the post-World War II United Nations world, including the birth of the IMF and the World Bank, which were established by conferences during World War II to begin operation at the end of the war. And Keynes was a great thinker in all of that. So he wrote a very, very famous essay after World War I called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And by the peace, he meant the Versailles Treaty that ended World War I. And he said, this treaty is so harsh and so punitive to the losers, especially Germany, that it will not create political stability, social stability, or economic recovery. It's, to my mind, one of the most important essays of the 20th century. It says, be nice to those who you beat in a war, because what goes around comes around. And he, in a way, said, if Germany is put in this harsh situation, it could lead to future disaster. And he was prophetic, because the economic instability in Germany then gave rise to Hitler and gave rise to World War II and all the horrible consequences. So I like reading that essay as a reminder about be smart. Don't try to take every advantage. Don't try to take every risk up to the limit. Understand that when you're dealing with economics, you're also dealing with politics and you're dealing with society. And pushing people to the brink can be quite devastating. So that's why I asked you to read that. Then there are a number of essays and excerpts from books. This is a lifetime of reading, by the way. So if you haven't mastered all of it, I want you to take the time, quiet evenings, you've done your problem set, go back and do the readings, and then come back to me and say, why did you assign that? I don't even understand why it's on the list. We'll have a good discussion over 2 years about this. But the idea is step by step to see how our world was created and how each of the major episodes in our world were addressed by each one, how it was addressed by the thinkers at the time. And so you have a famous book, first economics book I ever read, actually, Limits to Growth, which was a book written in 1972, which said, if we continue with the world economy the way it's going right now, we will reach environmental and resource limits, which will not only stop future growth, but even cause a major crash of the world economy. When I read that, my teachers told me, we're assigning that to you because it's stupid. It's not going to happen. Economies are more flexible, they're more creative. If there are shortages in one area, then there will be substitution towards other resources. There will be technological change. And so we read it not so much because it was viewed as an accurate prophecy, but in a way in standard economics to say, don't believe this kind of pessimism. That's what Malthus said, and he was wrong. And now it's being said again, the modern Malthusian idea that there are limits to growth. Well, here we are now 43 years later, and we have to assess, again, what are these limits to growth? And we're going to talk about those kinds of limits. We're going to use a different phrase called planetary boundaries, which is what the ecologists suggest are, if not limits to growth, that limits to a certain kind of economic growth, to a kind of economic growth that is very intensive in the use of natural resources. That's the limits that we face. Maybe not limits to economic improvement, but limits to economic growth of the kind that we have with our current technologies. And so this limits to growth idea becomes quite important. Now, from 1972, when that book was published, till now, we have had several political attempts to introduce environmental sustainability alongside economic development, alongside ideas of social justice and social fairness. And in a way, that integrated vision that we can have economic growth, but combined with environmental sustainability and combined with social fairness is the basic idea of sustainable development. And the way that sustainable development is defined by the UN member states now, when they adopt the Sustainable Development Goals in a couple of weeks, because the document's already ready, it is an integrated vision in which economic, social, and environmental objectives are all achieved in a holistic way. That's the optimistic vision. Some people say, well, that can't be done. Malthus said, don't dream of it. Limits to Growth said, there's going to be a crash. But the idea of sustainable development is at least the attempt to chart out a path in which economic progress continues, especially economic progress for the poorest people in the world, so that they have the chance to catch up in living standards with the rest of the world, in which that economic progress is fair, and the term that will be used a lot at the UN and then in the future is socially inclusive. The idea meaning that every group in society, first girls and women together with boys and men, with gender equality for number one, and SDG 5 is for gender equality. In addition to gender equality, there are other kinds of social inclusion, meaning that the gaps of wealth and poverty should be not too wide and even narrowed. So SDG 10 calls for reducing the inequalities within countries and between countries, ending human rights abuses for the poor and the vulnerable. One of the targets under SDG 8 is to end modern forms of slavery. Now, when I first heard this a few years ago, I said, modern slavery ended in the 19th century. It's finished. But the more you look at the realities in the world with human trafficking, with bonded labor, with literal slavery in many places, estimates suggest that tens of millions of people are in some form of servitude that constitutes a modern form of slavery. And so this is one of the objectives of social inclusion, to end those human rights abuses and to make sure that the economy not only assures basic economic standards, but also basic human rights and basic human dignity. And then is the third pillar of environmental sustainability. And the main lesson that we'll see over the course of the next few weeks and over the next 2 years in this course is how many different ways the natural environment is being strained right now. This is rather shocking because climate change is the big headline right now, as it should be, because if we fail to stop the human-induced climate change, the consequences for every other part of the natural environment will be extraordinarily serious. There was just a study last week, for example, of what ocean warming will mean for marine ecology. And one ecologist said it's like putting the species in a blender. We don't know, because there's going to there will be forced mass change in the composition of ecosystems, because certain species will migrate, others not, and it's going to change the food webs and the ecosystem functioning. We're changing the chemistry of the oceans by the carbon dioxide dissolving in the seawater and turning it more acidic. Human activity, especially through agriculture, is leading to deforestation, and it's leading to massive land degradation. Human activity for agriculture, as well as for urban and industrial uses, is creating many, many new forms of water stress, because rivers and lakes are being depleted because mountain glaciers are retreating or melting under climate change, because there are now around 60,000 major dams on the world's rivers. Almost impossible to imagine a number like that, but all of the main rivers in the world, almost all of them, have been dammed now multiple times for irrigation, for hydropower, for other water uses, and so on. And this is leading to water stress. And climate change itself is changing rainfall patterns. It leads to faster evapotranspiration, that is, the water in the ground and in the soils evaporates or transpires through plant leaves faster when the temperatures are higher, so that soil moisture is reduced. So even if there's rain, there's not enough moisture in the soil for decent crops and so forth. Well, the point is, we got environmental problems all over the place. And I don't know how many people here still read Agatha Christie novels, murder mysteries, but the idea of an Agatha Christie murder mystery is that there were people riding on a train and someone's murdered, and there are 12 logical suspects. And you don't know which of them, because they all have motive, they all had an opportunity, and so forth. And I feel like that with the environment also, that every time we see some environmental crisis, like we're seeing amphibious species being depleted in number and facing extinction. And who to blame? Is it climate change? Is it chemical pollution? Is it pesticides? Is it fertilizer use? Is it land clearance? Is it water stress? Is it invasive species? And so, it's like an Agatha Christie novel. There's so many culprits possible that we are stressing the physical environment in so many ways. So the last readings on this introduction are readings from 1972 until now that give us the growing eyes open in the world that, oh my God, we've got a problem. 1972 had two big events associated with it. One was limits to growth, which I mentioned, which was a kind of major publishing event. It drew a lot of attention, rightfully. And the second was the first conference under UN auspices on the environment and development, putting the two sides together for the first time. And that was in Stockholm. The UN Conference on Environment and Development in 1972. That was the beginning of the sustainable development era. Of course, it was just the opening salvo. And it was known as an innovative and important conference, but it was mainly open our eyes, we've got a problem. Then came the next one 20 years later, the Rio Earth Summit. So you have reading from Limits to Growth. Then I should say, after that, the UN tends to work on an anniversary cycle. So we went from the Stockholm conference to the 20th anniversary, which would be the Rio Earth Summit. And in advance of the Rio Earth Summit, a commission was led by Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was Prime Minister of Norway. I worked with her very closely afterwards when she was Director General of the World Health Organization. She's one of the leading statesmen of our time, an absolutely remarkable leader. And she headed what became known as the Brundtland Commission, which put the concept of sustainable development into the public view, because that wasn't the term that was used in Stockholm. So that is a reading of the Brundtland World Commission on Environment and Development, 1987, which was in the lead up to the Rio Earth Summit. And the Brundtland Commission gave a famous definition to sustainable development that we'll mention and then not really use. because we're using a different one. But the Brundtland Commission definition was that each generation uses resources in a way to meet its own needs, but in a way that allows future generations to meet their needs. That was the rough paraphrase of sustainable development in the Brundtland Commission, meeting current needs in a way that allows future generations to meet their needs. And that is an intergenerational definition, obviously. It's talking about what we do today and how it affects the future, all very legitimate. And that became more or less the definition of sustainable development for many years, until gradually it changed from that kind of intergenerational idea to the three sector or the triple bottom line idea of economic, social, and environmental objectives. They're similar and they're related, but now we speak mostly in terms of the triple bottom line, economic, social, and environmental, rather than the intergenerational definition. Well, after the Brundtland Commission came the Rio Earth Summit, and the Rio Earth Summit was a major watershed of sustainable development, because it was the time when the world's government said, sustainable development, that's it. That's our centerpiece. And three big treaties were negotiated at the Rio Earth Summit. The first one was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. That's the one that we'll meet on in Paris. The second one was the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this was a worldwide agreement to head off the human destruction of biodiversity, the fact that economic activity, pollution, deforestation, ocean acidification, climate change, all the things I mentioned, are leading to a major extinction process underway, in which the rate of other species going extinct is estimated by the biologists to be about 1,000 times larger than the rate of extinction by natural processes before the industrial era began. Species do go extinct. Dinosaurs we know, went extinct. Not through human cause, there were no human beings, but perhaps through climate change or an asteroid collision with the Earth, or a combination of factors. And species go extinct through natural processes. But the estimate now is that the rate of species extinction has been increased about 1,000 times because of human activity. And some scientists are calling our situation today the sixth great extinction wave, because the Earth has experienced 5 major extinctions, all through natural processes up until now, being hit by an asteroid or plate tectonics or some other factor like that. But this is the first time that one species may be causing the great extinctions of the other species. So a treaty was agreed in 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity. That one, the United States didn't even join. And we'll discuss that, but many, I would say, of the right wing in the United States said, we think property rights are more important than species survival, and people have the freedom to do what they want on their land, and this is a danger to private property. And so the Congress never ratified, the Senate never ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity in the United States. And worldwide, the treaty has not had any real effect, I would say. The third big treaty that was adopted at the Rio Earth Summit was the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD. And that is a treaty to stop human-caused land degradation. The term desertification is itself a term that has a lot of different definitions. We think of it as meaning the spread of deserts, but more generally at a technical level, it means the degradation of land so that it is no longer economically usable. So farmland in which soil erosion or land erosion renders the land degraded and unfit for crop production, for example. And the UNCCD is a convention that aims to slow and stop and reverse ultimately the degradation of land in the dryland regions of the world, places where the balance of rainfall and evapotranspiration are such that soils are dry, crop seasons are short, people are living usually often through animal husbandry in very difficult dry environments. And a lot of those environments in the Sahel of Africa, the Horn of Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East are in crisis. They're in water crisis. They're in demographic crisis. They're in economic crisis. They're in social crisis. They're in political crisis. And so the UNCCD aimed to slow and eventually reverse land degradation in the dryland regions. Who here today ever heard of the UN Convention to Combat Desertification before I just mentioned it? Oh, good. Okay. We have an intelligent class. Of course we do. But about 20%. That's about 20% more than I would have guessed. Because the rest of us, we never even heard of this thing. And this is important. It's important because you look at where the wars are today. Mali, Central African Republic, Chad, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan. What's one thing that you would say about all of those from the start? I'd say they're dry, with a lot of hunger and a lot of environmental stress. Maybe this treaty could actually help address some of the underlying root causes of this long arc of crisis. But the treaty, like so many things, was adopted and then never followed up. So the Rio Earth Summit adopted these three big treaties. It also adopted something called Agenda 21. Agenda 21, something that probably more of you have heard of. People nodded their heads, but I bet none of you has read it cover to cover, and nor have I, despite teaching this subject for 20 years plus, because it's hundreds of pages, fairly turgid, directives, instructions, objectives, goals, and so on, and it never caught hold, except in a few very, very attentive places on the planet. It never caught hold as a true global agenda, even though it was agreed to be one. So on your reading list, you have documents from 1992 on the Rio Earth Summit. Okay, three big treaties and Agenda 21. Agenda 21 kind of disappeared, and the three big treaties never were quite implemented. And the world economy went on. Not all disaster. There was a lot of economic growth. The 20 years after Rio was the surge of China as one of the great economic powerhouses of the world economy, the great industrial center of the world. India had growth. After around 2005, Africa started to have more economic growth. But it was not sustainable development because the growth was environmentally destructive and socially exclusive rather than inclusive in a lot of ways, with inequalities widening, with many people left behind, many people pushed behind. So in the UN cycle, we reached 2012. 2012 was the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit. It was kind of a somber affair because the Rio Earth Summit had been a great achievement, and yet the 3 treaties had not been implemented. And Agenda 21, nobody even remembered what that was by then. And so at the Rio Earth Summit, the government said, what should we do? And they looked at a parallel process that was underway, which we'll talk about, called the Millennium Development Goals. Those were goals that had been adopted at the start of the millennium in the year 2000, again, by the UN member states, not legally binding, not a treaty, but as goals to say, let's fight extreme poverty. And they had had some effect, probably more effect than the treaties, which is odd because legally binding treaties, you'd say, that's legally binding. Of course we're going to do that, whereas the other is just a statement of intentions. But it turned out the statement of intentions probably was more inspirational in a way, captured the public mood more, whereas the legally binding treaties went straight to the lawyers, straight to the diplomats, straight to the politicians who have a very sophisticated way of doing nothing or of blocking action. So in a way, the Millennium Development Goals took some life, not completely changing the way the world works, but directing some attention and resources towards global poverty, whereas the legal treaties had not done so. So in 2012, the governments got together and said, what do? We really need sustainable development. We really need to integrate economic, social, and environmental objectives. How can we do that? And they said, that those MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, seem to be creating some kind of public awareness and even political action. We need the same for sustainable development. And since the Millennium Development Goals were to come to an end in 2015, and the UN General Assembly had already said, well, after 2015, we'll need further objectives for the next phase, the government said, let's have sustainable development goals, or SDGs, to follow the MDGs. And in the document on your reading list called The Future We Want, that's what's sometimes called the final outcome document of that summit. It's the concluding, like the communique, but it's a long statement. And in it, you'll find the statement, we need sustainable development goals. To get those sustainable development goals, the UN General Assembly, with its 193 member countries, was tasked, come up with a global agreement. And they said, we don't want the UN bureaucracy doing this. We don't want the UN Secretariat doing this. We don't want the Secretary General of the UN saying, these are the goals. We want this to be an agreement among governments. And so that's the purpose of the General Assembly taking that, and to create an intergovernmental agreement. I have a theorem which has just recently been disproved, but it was a very good theorem for a long time. It said if you give the UN a certain amount of time, they'll use every last second of it to do this. So I thought the negotiations for the SDGs would go all the way from 2012 to September 24th at 11:59. But interestingly, they finished early. They finished actually on August 2nd. And so now we know what the governments are going to agree on September 25th, because the gavel has already gone down. The General Assembly has already said, here are the goals. And that's the last item on this introductory reading list called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And in that, you will find 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And by next week, you will know them by heart. Not all 169 targets, but if I say SDG 3, health for all, SDG 4, education for all. SDG 13, easy, stop human-induced climate change. SDG 16, no problem, peaceful and inclusive societies. SDG 1, simplest of all, end extreme poverty by 2030. So they each have a headline, then they have a long description, then they have each 10 or 15 targets. I have not memorized them. There are 169 targets under these goals. Even the document admits, don't take them so literally, these targets, because each country will have to find its own priorities because it's too many, but they couldn't figure out a way to negotiate it down. But the 17, definitely you should know, and you should know them quite quickly. And indeed, if I could just show one, now let's see if I can figure out how to do this. And amazing. This one. Okay. I was going to talk about all of this, but I did talk about it, but didn't show you any of it. But it's posted. 17 Sustainable Development Goals. That's what I really want you to know, okay? So they each have a logo. They will be in advertisements and on posters all over the world for years to come. I was very worried about the number 17, by the way, because it's a big number. And I said, 17, how are you even going to show that? But I hadn't realized that 17 is 3 times 6. If you have one box that says Sustainable Development Goals. So this is actually very nice graphics. These are the main goals that we're going to be talking about. One can talk about them at the level of public understanding that says SDG 13, we need climate action. But of course, one needs to talk about them at the level of professional implementation. And that's what your 2 years of work is about. What does it really mean to have climate action? How can this be done? What are the technical, technological, economic, political, social dimensions of climate action? How can a goal like SDG 13 actually be achieved? So that is our agenda. I should say a word while I have this PowerPoint up. Let me see if this goes. Nope. Okay, let's try it again. Now, what moves here? There. Okay. So I want you to look at the PowerPoint, even though I didn't discuss it today, but I do want to show you a few things about it very quickly, if I might. So first, there's a definition of sustainable development, which I've given as the 3-sector definition. And this year has 3 big summits. We already had one on finance. It ended okay with a general framework that says we need to make the financial system direct savings towards the SDGs. It didn't get too specific, so there's a lot of work to do. Then we have the September summit on SDGs, and we have the December meeting on climate change. Why do we need sustainable development urgently? This is the main thing that I want to just add. We're living in a particular time of history. That's the key. Every generation faces its own challenges. This topic would not have made much sense back in 1600 or 1200 or earlier periods of history. It makes a difference now because of this picture. This is the single most important invention of modern history. It's the steam engine. It was invented in the 18th century, mainly by James Watt, and it was this invention that made possible the industrial age. Without this, we didn't have the energy for steel production, for industrial processes, for rail or other technologies that have been the centerpiece of the industrial era. But with the ability to tap coal for steam to move things, the industrial age became possible. And after coal came oil, and after oil, natural gas. So we have a fossil fuel-based world economy that started with this invention and gave rise to the industrial era. And if you plot world output against time, it looks like this. Not very much, not very much, not very much, not very much. Thousands of years, century after century after century. Gee, this looks like the last century. This looks like the last century. You know, for 10,000 years, isn't something going to happen? And then James Watt comes along. I'm simplifying a little bit, but the steam engine makes possible the modern age. And we enter this period of sustained economic growth built on industrialization, powered by fossil fuels. That's our era. It's now gone on for more than 2 centuries since industrialization started. It made the whole modern world. How much of history came from the fact that a certain part of the world developed and another part didn't, and the part that did develop beat the crap out of the part that didn't develop, took over, created the colonial era and all the rest. Modern history came with this unprecedented burst of economic power turned into military power, turned into political dominance, and so on and so forth. But from an economist's vantage point, look at the big picture, you say, oh my God, the world economy has expanded in size, in income levels, in output levels, in resource use, roughly 100 times since the Industrial Revolution began. That's our truth. And output per person went up hugely, same way. And population, same thing. That's our new era. What we're talking about today would make no sense for students in 1700. If they were sitting in class, what are you talking about? Because we're studying the results of 200 years of economic growth. And the main point that I want to say about that is one picture. The economic growth has led to a lot of reduction of poverty, a lot of improvements of living standards. That's why we like economic development. It's led to more than doubling of life expectancy. It has led to dramatic gains in well-being, in reductions of hunger, reductions of poverty. But the physical implications of this are pressing against physical planetary boundaries. And that's the term we're going to be using, the planetary boundaries. That when you have so much fossil fuel use, so much food production, so much fertilizer use, so much demand for water, that the environmental consequences are unprecedented. And we have global scale consequences. That's how good we are, you see? Because 2 generations ago, when the Stockholm Conference happened, when Limits to Growth was written, that was about now. Now we're now. Now we've had that economic growth. And the size of the human activity, 7.3 billion people. Average output per person, about $13,000. Total annual production by the whole world economy added together, about $106 trillion. How to have all of that economic activity and still live within planetary environmental boundaries. That is our most important subject, and that's what we're going to be talking about during the semester. So with that, I will leave it now. On these historical readings, you won't get it the first time or the 5th time or the 10th time exactly what you're reading, but they're really worth reading because they will give you the 200-year framework. Oops.
No, you're fine.
Okay. The 200-year framework of the modern industrial era. And that is understanding that background, how we got to where we are, will make it possible for us to understand where we should be going. So let's take a pause here. Thank you to everyone in other classrooms around the world, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff, do you have a few minutes?
Yeah, I think we stopped the global classroom.
Yeah, the global classroom is stopped.
We'll have a few minutes of discussion here.
So we're going to be stopping the global classroom momentarily. Thank you, folks. We'll see you again, same time next week.